In the years before D-Day, the German officer corps laughed at the thought of fighting Americans. To them, the United States was a nation of amateurs, industrialists, not warriors. Their soldiers, they believed, were soft, inexperienced, and dependent on machines. Their officers, products of democracy, lacked the iron discipline and field instinct that defined the Wehrmacht. The arrogance was deep-rooted. After the lightning victories of 1940, the conquest of Poland, the fall of France, the humiliation of Britain at Dunkirk, German confidence in its military system was absolute. The Wehrmacht had crushed every opponent it faced. Its generals had grown used to success measured in weeks, not years. And across the Atlantic, the Americans seemed laughably slow. In 1940, when Germany's armored divisions rolled into Paris, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in size, behind Portugal. Its tanks were obsolete, its tactics outdated, its commanders untested. When Hitler's officers joked about the Americans, they did so with conviction. But by 1944, that laughter would turn to disbelief. It began with misunderstanding. German intelligence viewed the United States as a nation of engineers, capable of building ships and planes in enormous numbers, but incapable of using them with skill. They saw production, not strategy, quantity, not quality. The early campaigns seemed to prove them right. In 1942, when American troops landed in North Africa, the German Afrika Korps, under General Erwin Rommel, smashed them at Kasserine Pass. Rommel's veterans scoffed at the Green Americans, calling them children playing at war. Reports from the front reinforced the prejudice. The American soldier lacks initiative, one German field officer wrote. He depends on orders for everything. Without leadership, he is lost. In Berlin and Paris, the officers' messes buzzed with confidence. They have factories, a colonel laughed, but no fighters. They were certain that if the Americans ever invaded Europe, it would be a disaster. A repeat of Dieppe or Anzio, crushed before it began. But they didn't understand what America had become. After every defeat, the Americans learned. At Kasserine, they replaced generals, retrained divisions, and reorganized their supply lines. Their logistics, once clumsy, became the envy of the world. Their commanders like Omar Bradley, Dwight Eisenhower, and George S. Patton studied the enemy's tactics and adapted faster than the Germans thought possible. And all the while, Britain became a fortress of preparation. By 1944, southern England was a sea of men and machines. Over 2 million Allied troops, thousands of tanks, and mountains of supplies. American engineers built roads, airfields, and depots that stretched for miles. The Germans watched from across the Channel, still convinced the invasion would fail. Hitler's intelligence services expected the Allies to attack the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route to France. To reinforce this belief, the Allies staged one of the greatest deceptions in history, Operation Fortitude. They created a fake army, the first U.S. Army group, commanded on paper by General Patton, the man the Germans feared most. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and false radio signals all pointed to Calais as the target. And it worked. The German high command swallowed the lie completely. Even as the real invasion fleet began to cross the Channel in early June, the Germans were certain it was a diversion. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the laughter stopped. Over 5,000 ships filled the Channel. 11,000 aircraft darkened the sky. Paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. And on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the largest amphibious invasion in human history began. At first, many German officers refused to believe it. In their coastal bunkers, they waited for orders that never came. Field Marshal von Rundstedt demanded permission to move his panzer reserves. Hitler, asleep at his headquarters, could not be disturbed. When he finally awoke hours later, he was convinced the attack at Normandy was only a feint. Precious time was lost. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced brutal resistance. The 352nd Infantry Division, one of Germany's best coastal units, poured machine gun fire onto the sand. Waves of soldiers fell under the storm. For hours, it seemed the German officers were right, that the invasion would drown in blood. But the Americans did not break. Small groups of men clawed their way forward, blasting through wire and bunkers. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Naval gunners brought their ships in close, shelling German positions point blank. By noon, the impossible had begun to happen. The Americans were on the cliffs. German commanders at Caen and Bayeux stared in disbelief. Reports came in of U.S. armor landing on Utah, of British paratroopers capturing bridges, of chaos spreading along the coast. The soft Americans were holding. By evening, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall, that symbol of Nazi invincibility, was crumbling. That night, as German officers gathered around their maps, the mood had changed. No one was laughing now. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, noted grimly, "The enemy is not what we expected. Their coordination is extraordinary. Their movement, unstoppable." For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy that matched its skill and exceeded its endurance. American logistics poured fresh troops, ammunition, and vehicles across the beaches. German counterattacks faltered under relentless airstrikes. Rommel, inspecting the front days later, admitted the truth. "The invasion front is widening," he told his staff. "If we cannot throw them back into the sea now, we have lost the war." He was right. D-Day shattered the myth of German superiority. The Americans the officers had mocked were now the masters of initiative, innovation, and courage. Their factories had built the war machine, but their soldiers, once dismissed as untested, proved they could match any veteran the Reich could send. In the months that followed, as Allied armies broke through Normandy and swept toward Paris, the last illusions of German invincibility died. By August 1944, one Wehrmacht diary captured the final admission. "The Americans fight with a strength we did not expect. They never stop. Their power is endless. Against them, we are only delaying the inevitable." The laughter that once echoed in the officers' mess was gone, replaced by silence, disbelief, and the realization that Germany had underestimated not just a nation, but an idea. Because on June 6, 1944, the Americans proved something the world, and their enemies, would never forget. That resolve, once awakened, is stronger than arrogance. That industry, when fueled by purpose, can move mountains. And that courage, the kind found on the beaches of Normandy, can change the course of history. In the hours and days after June 6, 1944, confusion spread through the German command like wildfire. Reports from Normandy were fragmentary, chaotic, and unbelievable. Entire coastal defenses were collapsing. Communications were severed by Allied paratroopers. The once vaunted Atlantic Wall, the pride of Hitler's defensive genius, was breaking apart under relentless assault. German officers could not comprehend it. For years, they had laughed at the notion that untested American soldiers could stand against the veterans of the Wehrmacht. But on D-Day, they had stood. And more than that, they had advanced. At Hitler's headquarters in Berchtesgaden, disbelief reigned. Field Marshal Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the German High Command, was convinced that Normandy was only a diversion. The real invasion, he argued, would strike at Calais, where the channel was narrowest. His reasoning seemed logical. After all, the Allies had spent months feeding false intelligence to reinforce that assumption. But on the beaches, reality was taking shape in blood and steel. By midday on June 6th, over 4,000 Allied ships had delivered men and equipment to Normandy. Tanks rolled off landing craft. Bulldozers cleared the beaches. Engineers built temporary harbors, the mulberries capable of unloading thousands of tons of supplies each day. Meanwhile, German reinforcements, delayed by confusion, sabotage, and Allied air attacks, struggled to reach the front. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines bombed, and convoys strafed by P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers. The vaunted German mobility, the lightning-fast coordination that had once defined Blitzkrieg, was gone. On June 7th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, arrived in Normandy. What he saw horrified him. The beaches, he reported, were lost. Allied troops were establishing strongholds faster than the Germans could respond. Rommel understood what others in the German High Command refused to accept. This was the main invasion. He pleaded for permission to pull back armored reserves immediately and crush the beachheads before the Allies could link up. But Hitler, still convinced that Normandy was a deception, refused. The enemy has not yet committed his main force, he insisted. We will strike at Calais. Those words sealed Germany's fate. For days, the Americans clung to the beaches under withering fire. At Omaha, the fighting was ferocious. German machine gunners entrenched in concrete bunkers poured bullets into the surf. Bodies floated in the tide. But hour by hour, the Americans pushed forward, yard by yard, trench by trench. By June 8th, they had captured Vierville and Saint-Laurent. The beachhead was secure. German officers watched in disbelief as Allied engineers transformed the coastline into a logistical powerhouse. What the Germans had considered an invasion beach became, within days, an immense military port. In the towns behind the front, German officers began to grasp the scale of the disaster. Their telephones no longer worked. Fuel convoys were destroyed by airstrikes. Artillery ammunition ran low. Units fought in isolation, their commanders guessing at the situation miles away. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Every daylight movement brought the risk of annihilation. Our soldiers fight like lions, one German divisional commander wrote, but they fight blind and surrounded. The Americans, when once mocked as clumsy and slow, were methodical, relentless, and organized. Their artillery coordination was precise. Their logistics were unmatched. For every German tank destroyed, 3 new American Shermans rolled off the landing craft. Even the German generals, who still mocked the Americans' tactics, could no longer deny their efficiency. The U.S. Army system of constant resupply, rotating fresh divisions into battle, and using overwhelming firepower was wearing the Wehrmacht down faster than it could recover. By mid-June, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, sent a desperate message to Berlin. We cannot hold them. The enemy's superiority in men and materiel is decisive. Hitler's response was fury. He dismissed the warning, claiming defeatism. Rundstedt was replaced by Günther von Kluge, but nothing changed. The situation was beyond saving. In the German officers' mess at Saint-Lô, morale crumbled. Those who had once laughed at American incompetence now whispered of American precision. Captured prisoners revealed a chilling truth. The Americans were not only numerous, they were learning fast. Units that had landed on June 6 already fought with the confidence of veterans. Their coordination with naval and air forces was flawless. Rommel, driving through the chaos, confided to his adjutant, "The war will be lost here, in France." The Americans are not what we believed. He was right again. On June 19, a violent storm hit the Channel. For 3 days, it battered the Normandy beaches, destroying landing craft and supply ships. The Germans saw their chance, a window to strike while the Allies were cut off. But the opportunity passed. German divisions were scattered, exhausted, and out of fuel. By the time the weather cleared, the Americans were moving again. Faster, stronger, more determined. The German laughter of 1942 had turned into the silence of disbelief. By the end of June, the Allies had landed over 850,000 men in France. Eisenhower's armies were expanding the beachhead, linking the British, Canadian, and American sectors into one massive front. The German 7th Army, the same force that had once driven across Europe, was now fighting for its life. The reality was undeniable. The Americans the Germans had ridiculed as amateurs were now masters of modern war. Combining air, land, and sea with precision, the Wehrmacht could no longer match. Their strength was not in individual heroics, but in coordination, adaptability, and sheer determination. Rommel himself summed it up best in a report to Hitler. The enemy's system of warfare is based upon the greatest material superiority and a complete mastery of the air. The American soldier is not superior individually, but his command structure, his supply, and his technology make him invincible in the long run. He had stopped laughing. So had every German officer who had once mocked them. And the worst was yet to come, because what began on the beaches of Normandy would soon become the total collapse of the German West. By late June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy was no longer just a beachhead. It was an unstoppable machine. Every day, more men, more tanks, and more supplies poured into northern France. The American logistics system, which German officers had once mocked as clumsy and inefficient, was operating with clockwork precision. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express began to roll, a vast convoy system manned mostly by African American drivers who worked day and night carrying fuel, ammunition, and food from the beaches to the front. It became the lifeline of the Allied advance. German generals accustomed to elegant, tightly coordinated operations could not comprehend this scale. To them, war was about precision and elite skill, not logistics. But the Americans had rewritten the rules. They fought with industry. Every bullet fired, every tank fueled, every meal eaten was the product of an industrial giant moving with purpose. The German officers who once joked that America could build cars, not armies, now faced an enemy that could build both, faster than anyone in history. By early July, the Allies had expanded their foothold deep into Normandy's hedgerow country, a nightmare of dense fields and earthen walls that turned every mile into a killing zone. The Germans defended fiercely. The elite Panzer divisions, Lehr, Das Reich, and 2nd SS, launched counterattacks, inflicting heavy casualties. The Americans struggled. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Infantry were ambushed at close range, and every field became a fortress. But unlike the rigid German command, the Americans adapted. Engineers devised ways to mount iron blades, rhino tusks, on the fronts of Sherman tanks, allowing them to smash through hedgerows. Infantry began to coordinate with artillery and air power in near-perfect timing. Every day they learned, and every day they improved. By mid-July, the difference in command philosophy was obvious. German officers followed orders from Berlin without question, often outdated by the time they arrived. American officers, trained in flexibility, made decisions on the ground, fast, pragmatic, and responsive. This freedom of action, once criticized as undisciplined, became their greatest strength. On July 18th, the British launched Operation Goodwood, a massive tank assault near Caen. It pinned down German armor, allowing the Americans to prepare for their own breakout. Their plan, Operation Cobra. For days, the skies filled with aircraft, B-17, B-24s, and P-47s, forming waves of thunder that would smash open the German defenses. When the bombardment began on July 25th, it was like nothing the Germans had ever faced. Entire panzer regiments disappeared under the bombardment. Roads were cratered beyond recognition. When the American infantry advanced, what remained of the German front had been shredded into chaos. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt, could only watch in disbelief. His communications were collapsing. His fuel was gone. His men, once the elite of Europe, were exhausted and leaderless. And through the smoke came the Americans, faster and fiercer than ever before. The breakout from Normandy was total. American armor poured through the gap, led by General George S. Patton's Third Army. Town after town fell in rapid succession. The German Seventh Army, trapped and broken, tried to retreat east, but it was too late. By mid-August, the Allies had encircled tens of thousands of German troops near the town of Falaise. It was a slaughter. The Falaise Pocket, as it became known, marked the end of the German army in France. German officers who had once boasted that no American can fight a German in open battle now watched their divisions annihilated by relentless artillery, airstrikes, and coordination they could not match. In a single week, over 50,000 German soldiers were captured, 10,000 were killed, and thousands more fled east on foot, abandoning their weapons. The fields were littered with burned-out panzers and the wrecks of an army that had once conquered Europe. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. The French capital, occupied for 4 long years, erupted in celebration. The German command's laughter from 1942 was now replaced with silence. For the Americans, D-Day had been just the beginning. In less than 3 months, they had done what the world once thought impossible: forced the Germans into retreat on their own soil. At Hitler's headquarters, the news was catastrophic. Rommel, gravely injured in an air attack, was gone. Von Kluge, accused of treason, took his own life. Hitler raged at his generals, blaming them for cowardice, incompetence, and betrayal. But the truth was simpler. They had lost to an enemy they had underestimated. Captured German officers, interrogated by Allied intelligence, admitted their surprise. They spoke with grudging respect for the Americans. They are not soldiers of genius, one colonel said, but they have everything in abundance. Men, machines, and above all, energy. Another noted, they never stop coming. Even when you think they are finished, another wave appears. Their courage is not dramatic, but constant. The same arrogance that had defined the German high command, the belief that discipline and experience alone won wars, had been shattered. By September, Allied troops stood at the edge of the German border. The Reich that had once stretched from the Atlantic to Moscow was now collapsing from within. The officers who had once mocked the Americans now faced a grim realization that industrial might, coordination, and unity had defeated their precision and pride. Rommel's prophecy had come true. Germany's fate had been decided not by a single battle, but by a nation that learned how to fight faster than anyone believed possible. And as the Americans crossed the Seine and turned toward the Rhine, they carried with them not just momentum, but the unshakable belief that nothing could stop them now. The laughter that once filled the officers' mess in 1942 was gone forever. In its place was the thunder of engines, the march of men, and the sound of history itself, rolling east toward Germany. By September 1944, the German army was in retreat across France. The Wehrmacht, once feared as the most disciplined, efficient military force in the world, was shattered and disorganized. The mighty panzer divisions were reduced to a handful of tanks. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited, and morale collapsing. In Berlin, Hitler raged. He refused to believe the scale of the disaster. He blamed his generals for cowardice and betrayal, ordering counterattacks that were impossible. His obsession with holding every inch of ground turned retreat into massacre. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced faster than anyone, faster than their own supply lines could handle. The Red Ball Express, that endless river of trucks, could not keep up with the pace of liberation. Patton's tanks were running low on fuel, even as German forces crumbled before them. For a brief moment, it seemed the war could end by Christmas. The Allies were at the doorstep of Germany. The Siegfried Line, Hitler's last great line of defense, lay ahead. But the closer they came to the Reich, the harder the fighting became. The Germans were retreating, yes, but they were far from finished. In September, Operation Market Garden was launched, the bold plan to seize bridges in the Netherlands and open a path into Germany's heart. Paratroopers from the United States, Britain, and Poland descended from the skies. It was the largest airborne operation in history, but it was also a gamble. The Americans captured their objectives quickly. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen fell after fierce fighting, but at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was trapped and overwhelmed. The plan failed. The road to Berlin would not be easy. As autumn turned to winter, the Allies halted to regroup. The supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Normandy. Every bullet, every shell, every meal had to cross France by truck. The rains came. The roads turned to mud. In those cold, weary weeks, the Germans saw an opportunity. Hitler ordered a desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same forest he had used to invade France in 1940. His generals doubted the plan, but they obeyed. Their goal, divide the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a peace on the Western Front. It was madness. But in December 1944, it nearly worked. On the morning of December 16th, under heavy fog and snow, German artillery unleashed hell on the American lines in Belgium. Panzer divisions surged forward, catching the Allies completely off guard. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In those first days, the Germans achieved total surprise. Entire American units were surrounded or destroyed. Towns like Saint-Vith and Clairvaux fell under the assault. The 106th Infantry Division was wiped out. The 101st Airborne was encircled in Bastogne. The laughter and the arrogance seemed to return among German officers. Once again, they saw American troops in retreat, their lines in chaos. The Americans are soft, some said. They cannot hold in winter. But they were wrong. The Americans dug in, refused to surrender, and fought back with a determination that stunned the German high command. At Bastogne, surrounded by armor and artillery, General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply to a German demand for surrender was one word: nuts. Through blizzards and bombardment, The 101st held the town. Then when the skies cleared, the Allied air power returned. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and bombers swept over the battlefield, smashing German supply lines and armor. The tide turned once more. By January 1945, the bulge had collapsed. What was meant to split the Allies had instead destroyed Germany's last reserves. The fuel shortage was catastrophic. Hundreds of tanks were abandoned where they ran dry. The once proud German divisions were retreating again, now permanently. Hitler had gambled everything and lost. For American soldiers, the Ardennes was proof of how far they had come. In 1942, they were inexperienced and unsure. By 1945, they were hardened, disciplined, and relentless. Captured German reports revealed a new tone. Gone was the mockery, the superiority. In its place was respect. American troops fight with stubbornness, one officer wrote. Their artillery coordination is terrifying. They learn faster than we can adapt. Another added simply, they do not know when to quit. By March 1945, the Allied armies had reached the Rhine, the gateway to Germany, the last barrier between them and total victory. At the town of Remagen, American troops found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. A miracle. Before the Germans could destroy it, U.S. forces charged across, securing the first bridgehead on German soil. It was a symbol. The laughter of 1942, the arrogance that once filled Nazi briefings, had turned into disbelief. The German army was broken. The Luftwaffe no longer ruled the air. Every day, thousands of German soldiers surrendered, exhausted and starving. American columns rolled through village after village, their tanks unstoppable. Even some German civilians began to greet the Americans not with hatred, but with relief, a strange acknowledgement that the war their leaders had promised to win was lost beyond repair. The Reich was collapsing, and as the Americans crossed into the heart of Germany, they began to see, truly see, what they were fighting against. Camps, prisoners, civilians destroyed by their own regime. The laughter had long since died. What remained was silence, and the grim understanding of what the war had really cost. The Germans had mocked the Americans as amateurs, but on the battlefields of Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine, it was the Americans who proved that determination, industry, and unity could overcome arrogance and cruelty. What began with laughter ended with surrender, and in that transformation lay one of history's greatest reversals, a reminder that the underestimated often have the last word. By March 1945, the American army had achieved the impossible. In just 9 months, they had landed on the beaches of Normandy, liberated France, defeated the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, and crossed the Rhine into the heart of the Third Reich. What began with doubt and ridicule had turned into one of the most astonishing military campaigns in modern history. The Rhine was not just a river, it was a symbol, the final natural barrier before the heart of Germany. For centuries, invading armies had stopped there. Napoleon had crossed it, but no one since had dared. Hitler believed it would stop the Americans as it had stopped so many before, but he underestimated them again. At Remagen, on March 7, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood. German engineers had tried to demolish it, but the charges failed. When American scouts saw the intact bridge through the smoke, they couldn't believe their eyes. Within hours, troops of the 9th Armored Division stormed it under heavy fire, crossing into Germany itself. It was a moment that shocked the world and humiliated the German command. The crossing at Remagen became a turning point. Within days, thousands of troops and tanks poured across the bridge. German officers, who had once mocked the Americans for being untested and weak, now called them unstoppable. Hitler, furious, ordered an airstrike on the bridge. He even executed officers who had failed to destroy it in time. But nothing could change the outcome. The Americans were inside Germany, and the end was near. Everywhere, the German army was collapsing. Town after town surrendered with little or no resistance. Civilians, desperate and starving, fled westward to escape the advancing Red Army from the east. The once proud Wehrmacht, now filled with teenage recruits and old men, could no longer fight the industrial machine that the United States had unleashed. The numbers told the story. In 1944 alone, American factories produced nearly 50,000 aircraft, 30,000 tanks, and millions of tons of supplies. German production could not compete. Every day, the skies over Germany darkened with waves of Allied bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, pounding factories, bridges, and rail lines into dust. The Reich was running on fumes. In the final months of the war, the true power of American logistics became clear. What the German officers had once mocked as inefficiency was now their doom. The Red Ball Express, that ceaseless convoy of trucks, carried more supplies than the entire German army could move in a month. German officers marveled, even in defeat, at the Americans' ability to repair bridges overnight, lay railways in days, and build airfields from empty fields. They had not simply outfought the Germans, they had outbuilt them, outplanned them, and outlasted them. And yet, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, they discovered something darker. The hidden face of the regime they had fought so hard to destroy. In towns and forests, they stumbled upon concentration camps, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Nordhausen. The Americans had heard rumors, but nothing prepared them for what they saw. Emaciated prisoners, piles of bodies, crematoria still warm. The laughter that had once echoed in German officers' mess halls now seemed obscene. The arrogance that had mocked the naive Americans collapsed under the weight of truth. General Eisenhower, upon visiting the camp at Ohrdruf, ordered every available soldier and local civilian to see it with their own eyes. He knew that someday someone might deny it ever happened. He wanted witnesses. In his report to Washington, Eisenhower wrote, "I have never felt able to describe the horror I saw. It defies imagination. The liberation of the camps revealed not just the defeat of an army, but the moral bankruptcy of the ideology that had fueled it." By April 1945, the Allied armies were unstoppable. The Americans advanced from the west, the British from the north, and the Soviets from the east. Every mile revealed more destruction. Bridges blasted, cities burned, rivers choked with wreckage. Yet among the rubble, one thing was clear. The Third Reich was dying. In Berlin, Hitler raved in his bunker, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed. His generals no longer believed in victory, only in survival. Many surrendered to the Americans, preferring their captivity to the vengeance of the Red Army. On April 12, 1945, a shock spread through the Allied ranks. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. He had led the United States through the Depression and the war, but would not live to see its end. Soldiers wept openly when they heard the news. For them, Roosevelt had been more than a leader. He had been the voice that carried them from the dark days of Pearl Harbor to the brink of victory. Vice President Harry S. Truman took the oath of office that evening. His first words to reporters were simple: "I feel like the moon, the stars, and all the planets have fallen on me." But the mission continued. The armies pressed forward. By late April, the Americans reached the Elbe River. Across the water, Soviet troops were advancing from the east. On April 25th, at a small town called Torgau, they met. The war in Europe was effectively over. For the men who had crossed from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, it was a moment beyond words. The Germans who once laughed at them now approached with white flags, surrendering not just their weapons, but the arrogance that had once defined them. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the world that had mocked the Americans as amateurs now bowed to their victory. The United States, once dismissed as an industrial giant without discipline, had become a global power. Its soldiers had proven that courage, intelligence, and relentless effort could overcome centuries of militaristic tradition, and in doing so, they reshaped the 20th century. For Germany, the laughter was gone. For America, the lessons of Normandy, of Bastogne, and of Remagen would never be forgotten. The price had been unimaginable, but the world was free. In May 1945, Europe fell silent. After 6 long years of war, after tens of millions of lives lost and entire nations reduced to rubble, the guns finally stopped. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which once promised 1,000 years of dominance, had lasted only 12. For the soldiers who had landed on the beaches of Normandy less than a year earlier, it was a moment of disbelief. Many stood in the shattered streets of German towns, staring at the white flags fluttering from windows, wondering how something so vast could finally be over. They had marched through hell, from the beaches of France to the forests of Belgium, across rivers, minefields, and ruined cities. And somehow they had made it. The war that began with German laughter ended with American victory. But behind the triumph, there was exhaustion and grief. The cost of that victory had been enormous. Over 400,000 Americans had lost their lives. Millions more returned home wounded, physically and mentally. The joy of peace was mixed with the weight of what they had seen and what they had done. When the news of Germany's surrender reached Washington, crowds flooded the streets. In New York, church bells rang for hours. In London, people danced in Trafalgar Square. President Truman spoke to the nation, "This is a solemn but glorious hour." The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. But he also reminded Americans that the war was not yet over. Across the Pacific, Japan still fought fiercely. Victory in Europe was only half the journey. As the celebrations continued, American troops remained in Germany. They became not conquerors but occupiers, tasked with rebuilding a nation that had once vowed to destroy them. In the shattered cities, they saw the consequences of total war. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes, civilians searching through ruins for food, children orphaned, soldiers disillusioned, and prisoners freed from camps that defied comprehension. The Americans brought not revenge, but order. They distributed food, restored power, and helped re-establish local governments. What had begun as an invasion had become an act of reconstruction. And through that effort, something remarkable began to happen. Enemies became teachers, and occupiers became allies. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now commander of the Allied occupation, understood that true victory meant more than defeating an army. It meant defeating an idea. He told his officers, "The German people must see with their own eyes what their government has done. Only then can they rebuild something better." It was a vision of justice without vengeance, a strategy that would define America's role in the post-war world. In the months that followed, the Nuremberg trials began. The world's most powerful men, generals, ministers, industrialists, stood before judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. For the first time in history, war crimes were prosecuted not as acts of conquest, but as crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Films, documents, witnesses. The same officers who had once laughed at America's supposed weakness now stood in the dock, facing justice. Their laughter had turned to silence. The trials revealed more than guilt. They revealed the depth of delusion that had gripped the Nazi leadership. The belief that they were invincible, that the rest of the world would never unite against them, that their empire was destined to last forever. But on D-Day, that illusion had been shattered, and in the courtrooms of Nuremberg, the world ensured it would never rise again. Meanwhile, America itself was transforming. The war had changed everything, from technology to politics to identity. The GI Bill gave millions of veterans access to education and homes. Women who had worked in factories now demanded equal opportunity. Factories that once built tanks and bombers began producing cars, appliances, and the foundations of a new middle class. The nation that Germany had mocked as soft and decadent had emerged as the most powerful force on earth. But for many soldiers, peace was harder than war. They had lived by discipline and duty. Now they returned to quiet streets and ordinary lives. Some found comfort in family, work, and study. Others struggled with memories that refused to fade. The frozen fields of the Ardennes, the burning tanks outside Aachen, the faces of comrades left behind. The war had ended, but the noise of it lived on inside them. In Europe, the map had been redrawn. The Soviet Union now controlled half the continent. The Iron Curtain was descending. The same soldiers who had fought side by side with the Russians now looked at them with suspicion. The Cold War had begun. In the ashes of Berlin, where American and Soviet troops once shook hands, new lines of tension were forming. Germany would be divided, east and west, a scar that would last for decades. But through that division, one fact remained. The United States had proven itself not just a military power, but a global leader. The German officers who had once laughed at the Americans had been wrong about everything. They had mistaken youth for weakness, innovation for inexperience, and humility for fear. On June 6, 1944, that arrogance had begun to crumble, and by May 1945, it lay buried beneath the ruins of their empire. The Americans had done what the world thought impossible. They had crossed the sea, stormed the beaches, broken through the defenses of a continent, and destroyed one of the most powerful war machines in history. And on those same beaches, where the laughter once echoed, there is silence now. The kind of silence that belongs to sacred ground. Rows of white crosses mark the cost of freedom. Each one tells the same story, that courage is louder than mockery, and that the underestimated can change the course of history. When the war in Europe ended, the men who had stormed the beaches of Normandy were hailed as heroes, but few of them saw themselves that way. For them, it hadn't been glory, it had been duty, it had been survival. They had crossed oceans, faced fire, and watched friends fall beside them. They didn't fight for medals or recognition, they fought because it had to be done. In Normandy, the beaches where they once landed in chaos and blood were quiet again. The sea that had carried the invasion fleet now washed gently over the sand, erasing the traces of battle. But buried beneath that peace were memories the world would never forget. On Omaha Beach, crosses and stars of David stood in neat lines, white against the green hills and blue sky. Beneath each one lay a soldier who had crossed an ocean to liberate a continent he'd never seen before. Visitors who came in the years after the war often said that walking there felt like standing in the presence of something greater than history, something sacred. For the Germans, the aftermath was a reckoning. The officers who had laughed at America's entry into the war, who had once boasted that the cowboy soldiers would break at the first sign of real combat, were now prisoners of a nation they had mocked. Many of them sat in Allied camps, replaying the past in silence. Some refused to accept what had happened. Others admitted that they had underestimated the enemy. Not just the weapons, but the will. In letters and memoirs written years later, several former German officers reflected on the invasion that had changed everything. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had helped plan Germany's early campaigns, wrote, "D-Day was the beginning of the end. Once the Americans were established on the continent, it was only a matter of time. It was not just America's numbers or machines that had turned the tide. It was its persistence. The United States had built a war machine from nothing, mobilizing 16 million men and women, producing more aircraft, tanks, and ships than any nation in history. Factories that once made cars and washing machines now built bombers and rifles. Farmers grew food for armies half a world away. From small towns to great cities, an entire nation had turned its will into motion. The German officers had laughed at that too, at the idea that a democracy could fight with unity and purpose. They believed only discipline born of fear could win wars. But they were wrong. America had found strength not in obedience, but in belief. Belief in freedom, in each other, and in the idea that tyranny could not be allowed to stand. After the war, Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities, Hamburg, Warsaw, Berlin, were reduced to rubble. Tens of millions were homeless. Disease and famine threatened to follow where the bombs had fallen. And once again, the world looked to America. Instead of withdrawing across the ocean, the United States chose to rebuild what had been destroyed. The Marshall Plan, named for General George C. Marshall, the former Army Chief of Staff, poured billions of dollars into Europe's recovery. Factories reopened. Roads were rebuilt. Food was distributed. In the very nations that had once been enemies, children grew up eating American bread and walking on streets paved with American steel. This was more than generosity, it was strategy and vision. The Americans understood that peace could not survive on punishment alone. A stable Europe was the best defense against future wars. So where once the U.S. Army had fought its way across France and Germany, now American engineers, economists, and teachers followed, carrying not weapons, but blueprints, supplies, and knowledge. The laughter of German officers was gone. In its place was cooperation, the beginning of an alliance that would in time face a new kind of enemy. Because even as Europe began to heal, the world was dividing again. In the East, the Soviet Union extended its power across half the continent, drawing a line through Berlin and sealing it with ideology and fear. The Cold War had begun. The same American soldiers who had once fought alongside Soviet troops at the Elbe River now watched them from behind barbed wire and concrete walls. In the ruins of Germany, a new front had formed, not of guns and tanks, but of politics, intelligence, and the threat of annihilation. Still, the memory of D-Day endured, as a reminder of what unity could achieve when fear threatened to divide the world. It became a symbol not only of victory, but of cooperation. The moment when men of different nations, languages, and faiths had fought as one. Every June, veterans returned to Normandy. Some came on crutches, some in wheelchairs. Others simply stood and looked out to sea, their eyes searching the horizon where the invasion fleet had once appeared. They spoke quietly, sharing stories not of triumph but of loss, of friends left behind in the sand, of the fear that still haunted them at night. And among them were Germans too, men who had once been their enemies, now standing beside them in peace. Time had done what war could not. It had replaced hate with respect. The same beaches that had once divided the world now united it. Children played where soldiers had fallen. Flowers grew where craters once scarred the earth. And in the quiet wind that swept across Normandy, there was no laughter, no mockery, only remembrance. For those who had lived through that day, one truth would never fade. The Americans, once dismissed, once underestimated, had not only landed on those beaches, they had changed the course of history. As the 1950s dawned, the world was no longer divided by trenches or front lines. It was divided by fear. The old enemy had fallen, but a new shadow stretched across Europe. The Soviet Union's iron grip descended on the East, and the United States, the same nation once mocked as inexperienced and naive, now stood as the leader of the free world. But in the memories of those who had lived through D-Day, the lessons of 1944 were clear. The laughter of German officers, the arrogance that had once blinded them, was a warning to every generation. Never underestimate the will of a free people. The Americans had not won by sheer numbers alone. They had won because they learned, adapted, and refused to break. And in the years after the war, that same determination would define an era, not in battlefields of blood, but in boardrooms, laboratories, and diplomatic halls. The men who had stormed the beaches returned home to build new lives. They traded rifles for tools, helmets for hard hats, and began constructing the very world their sacrifice had made possible. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college. Entire towns sprang up to house the families of returning soldiers. Factories that had once built bombers now built cars, appliances, and airplanes for peace. It was the beginning of what historians would later call the American century. Across the Atlantic, Europe began to rise again. France and Germany, once enemies, rebuilt their cities from ruins. Britain, battered but unbroken, began the long road from austerity to recovery. And through it all, the legacy of D-Day endured. Those who had fought and died on the beaches of Normandy had proven that freedom, once threatened, could be defended by unity. And that idea, the unity of free nations, would soon form the backbone of a new alliance. NATO, founded in 1949. For the first time in history, the Western democracies swore a collective oath. An attack on one would be an attack on all. It was more than a military pact. It was the institutional memory of D-Day. The understanding that no nation, however powerful, could stand alone against tyranny. While Berlin was divided, while the world trembled under the threat of nuclear war, the spirit that had carried men up the beaches of Normandy still held fast. The laughter that had once echoed through German officer clubs was now replaced by silence. The silence of reflection, of recognition, of what arrogance had cost. For the German people, the years after 1945 were marked by reckoning and rebuilding. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. And as the Nuremberg trials began, the world confronted the full scale of what the war had revealed. crimes and horrors that went beyond battlefields, beyond comprehension. It was here that another truth emerged, that the laughter of the officers, the pride of the Reich, had not only been misplaced, it had been part of a delusion. The myth of invincibility had blinded them. Germany would rise again, but not through conquest. This time, through reflection, through democracy, and through humility. West Germany became a pillar of the very alliance it had once sought to destroy, a testament to how nations could learn, repent, and rebuild. For America, D-Day remained not just a victory, but a burden. It was proof of what courage could achieve and what it demanded in return. Every generation that followed would look back at June 6, 1944, and ask the same question: would we have done the same? The answer, perhaps, lies not in words but in legacy, because D-Day was not just about the liberation of Europe. It was about the rebirth of a world. In its wake came the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a fragile but enduring hope that cooperation could replace conquest. Yet even peace had its shadows. The veterans of D-Day carried invisible scars, memories of faces lost to the tide, of screams drowned beneath artillery and surf. For many, Normandy was not just a battlefield. It was the moment their youth ended. In small towns across America, memorials were built, granite walls engraved with names, bronze plaques marking the fallen, and on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, the ruins of German bunkers still stood, weathered and silent. Grass grew where machine guns once pointed toward the sea. It was a reminder to all who visited: victory comes at a price. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander of D-Day, spoke in his later years, he never claimed credit for the invasion's success. He said only this: it was the soldier, the sailor, the airman, the private in the field who did it all. They had faith and they had courage, and that courage had changed the course of the 20th century. In time, the laughter of those who doubted America became a footnote in history. What endured was the sound of the waves at Normandy, the rustle of flags in the wind, and the knowledge that ordinary men, farmers, clerks, teachers, sons, had done something extraordinary. They had crossed an ocean not to conquer, but to free. They had stormed a beach not for glory, but for duty. And in doing so, they had proven that the strength of a nation is not measured by its arrogance, but by its will. For the German officers who once laughed, history wrote its own answer. Carved not in stone, but in sacrifice. The Americans they had dismissed as amateurs had risen from the sea, faced the best army in the world, and won. Not because they were perfect, but because they refused to surrender. The years passed, but the memory of D-Day never faded. For the men who had lived it, time could dull the pain, but never erase the sound. The crash of waves, the whine of bullets, the roar of engines overhead. They could never forget what it felt like to step off a landing craft into the storm of June 6, 1944, knowing full well that they might not return. By the 1960s, the world had changed beyond recognition. The children of D-Day's soldiers were growing up in an age of peace and prosperity, an age made possible by the victory their fathers had earned. But across the Atlantic in Europe, the beaches of Normandy had become sacred ground. Pilgrims of remembrance, veterans, families, students, came to stand where the fate of the free world had once been decided. The sand, still scattered with shrapnel and metal fragments, became a silent memorial. For those who came, it was not about triumph, it was about humility, about standing where courage had spoken louder than fear. Historians often speak of D-Day in terms of strategy, of divisions, landing zones, and logistics. But to the men who were there, it was chaos. The plan, as one soldier later said, only lasted until the first shot was fired. After that, it was instinct, survival, and faith in the man beside you. That was what the German officers had never understood. They had believed in discipline, hierarchy, precision, in the machine of war. But they had underestimated the human spirit, the improvisation and courage that no doctrine could command. The Americans who fought on D-Day came from every corner of their nation, from small towns, farms, cities, and factories. Few had ever seen Europe before. Fewer still had imagined what it would cost to free it. But when the moment came, they met the test. Even German officers later admitted their respect. One prisoner captured after the invasion told an Allied interrogator, "The Americans, they learn faster than we expected. They fight with their hearts, not just their orders." That realization, perhaps more than any battle statistic, explained why the tide of war had turned. By the end of 1944, the same army that German officers had mocked as inexperienced was now fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. The same soft Americans who were said to lack endurance were now crossing the Rhine. And with every mile they advanced, the arrogance of 1940, the laughter in the German officers' mess, faded into silence. For the Americans, it was not just a military victory, it was a moral one. They had come from across an ocean, not to conquer, but to liberate, and in doing so, they had given Europe a chance to breathe again. The German officers who once saw the U.S. Army as a temporary nuisance were now witnessing something larger. A movement of nations, united not by empire, but by purpose. The Americans fought alongside the British, the Canadians, the French, the Poles, and countless others. Each spoke a different language. Each came from a different land. But on that beach they shared one belief, that tyranny could not be allowed to rule the world. That belief was what made D-Day more than an invasion. It made it a declaration, not just of war, but of humanity. When German survivors spoke of those days after the war, many said that D-Day was when they realized the inevitable. They had once believed in the invincibility of the Reich, but after June 1944, they knew the end was coming. One officer, interviewed years later, said quietly, "We laughed at the Americans. We thought them slow, undisciplined. But we forgot. They were fighting for something we had already lost. Faith. Faith. In freedom, in each other, in the belief that no nation, however far, was beyond redemption." That was what crossed the channel that day. It was not just men or weapons or ships. It was an idea. And that idea, carried in the hearts of every soldier who climbed the cliffs of Normandy, would outlast every empire that tried to silence it. The laughter of the German officers had begun in 1942 when the Americans first entered the war. They saw the United States as rich, untested, and disorganized, a nation of amateurs. But by 1945, that same nation had helped destroy the mightiest military machine the world had ever seen. And in the ruins of Berlin, there was no laughter left. Today, the beaches of Normandy stand quiet. The bunkers remain, half buried in the sand. The sea grass grows where once there was blood. And above them all, rows of white crosses mark the resting place of those who came from across the ocean to fight for a world they had never seen. Each one tells a story of courage, of sacrifice, of belief. And together they tell the story of how the laughter of arrogance was silenced by the courage of the ordinary. The German officers had laughed at the Americans, at their youth, their inexperience, their optimism. But in the end, it was that very optimism, that refusal to surrender to despair, that changed the world. For on June 6, 1944, when the first wave landed on the beaches of Normandy, the laughter stopped, and in its place began the long, quiet echo of freedom. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. The laughter that had once filled German officers' mess halls was gone, replaced by silence, disbelief, and the distant thunder of Allied artillery echoing across the Rhine. The Americans, once dismissed as amateurs, were now advancing through the heart of Germany itself. For many German officers, it was an ending they could scarcely comprehend. 5 years earlier, their armies had swept across Europe with unstoppable speed. Paris had fallen in weeks. Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Oslo had all bowed before the Wehrmacht's power. And in those early days, they had looked upon the United States as little more than an industrial giant. Wealthy, yes, but inexperienced, soft and unprepared for the brutal realities of modern warfare. They could not have imagined that within 3 years, that same nation would be standing at their gates. When the American soldiers first arrived on German soil, they found a country in ruins. Towns lay in ashes. Railways were twisted metal. Bridges, once vital to the Reich's might, had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. But amid that devastation, one truth became clear. The myth of German invincibility had died. Not in Berlin, not even in Stalingrad, but on the beaches of Normandy. That was where the illusion had broken, where the arrogance that had mocked the Americans was drowned beneath the waves of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. After D-Day, everything changed. The Americans had proven that they could plan, coordinate, and execute the largest amphibious invasion in history, under fire, against fortified positions, with the eyes of the world upon them. They had crossed not only the channel, but the line between hope and history. The German officers who survived those days often spoke of the shock, not of defeat, but of realization. They had underestimated not just the strength of the American army, but the resolve behind it. One officer, years later, recalled, "We thought we understood the Americans. Too many comforts, too little discipline. But they were something else entirely. Once they began to move, nothing stopped them. That relentlessness, that refusal to give up, became the defining mark of the Allied advance through Europe. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from the crossing of the Seine to the final battles on the Rhine, the Americans proved that endurance could be as powerful as experience. By April 1945, when Allied and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, the circle was complete. The Reich that had once stretched across a continent now existed only in fragments. And in those final days, even the proudest of German officers could no longer deny the truth. The Americans, whom they had once mocked, had become masters of modern war. Not through cruelty, but through resolve. Not through fear, but through faith in something greater than conquest. The United States had entered the war reluctantly, its people weary of foreign conflicts. But by the time the guns fell silent in Europe, it had emerged as one of the world's great powers. Its armies hardened, its industries unmatched, its ideals tested and proven in fire. In the aftermath, as the German officers sat in captivity, many pondered what had gone wrong. They had believed themselves to be the finest soldiers in the world, and in many ways they were disciplined, skilled, and fiercely loyal. But they had forgotten that wars are not won by arrogance or by experience alone. They are won by belief. Belief in freedom, in purpose, in something that cannot be measured by ranks or medals. That was what the Americans had brought to Normandy. Years later, when veterans on both sides met again, at memorials, on beaches, at reunions, the tone had changed. The laughter of 1940 was gone. In its place was respect. They spoke not of hatred, but of lessons, of how quickly power can blind and how easily pride can fall. One former German colonel, visiting Omaha Beach in 1964, stood silently for a long time before saying to a journalist beside him, "They were brave. We did not believe it then. But we learn today the white crosses and stars of David that line the Normandy cemeteries stand as more than graves. They are answers to arrogance, quiet reminders that freedom is never given, only earned. The names carved into those stones tell a single story, repeated thousands of times, that courage and conviction can overcome any empire built on pride." The German officers had laughed once at the Americans' optimism, their inexperience, their belief that right could triumph over might. But when the storm broke over Normandy, when the landing craft hit the sand and the sky filled with paratroopers, they stopped laughing. What replaced that laughter was something deeper: recognition. Recognition that the Americans, for all their youth and uncertainty, carried something far more dangerous than any weapon. They carried belief. From that belief came victory. From that victory came liberation. And from that liberation came a world rebuilt, not through conquest, but through hope. The story of D-Day is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of transformation, of arrogance humbled, of nations united, of courage made visible on the shores of Normandy. The German officers had laughed at the Americans once, but history does not remember their laughter. It remembers the sound of engines crossing the channel. It remembers the men who stepped into the surf that morning. It remembers the silence that followed, the silence of realization, of defeat, and of freedom hard won. The laughter faded long ago, but the echo of June 6, 1944, The day everything changed still rolls across the shores of Normandy. It was the day the world turned, the day the laughter stopped, and the day history took flight beneath the rising sun. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.